All right, good morning. Good morning. I need to take care of a couple things before we actually start class proper. First of all, I'm using a new app today that shows up on the screen, so I may fumble with it a couple of times, so I just want to let you know that that's what's going on. Supposedly it's better, but we'll see how that works out. The other thing is I appreciate those of you that have asked about our daughter-in-law. It was a little awkward last Sunday. I got a note that says that she's been taken to the emergency room and you need to finish early. So I tried, as you were aware of, I hurried through things and finished early, and then found out that Shirley had already gone. We had one of the grandsons with us and needed to get home so they could bring the second grandson by on their way to the hospital. And so Shirley had taken the car and gone on. I didn't realize that, and then Jerry Keeley gave me a ride home. So it all worked out okay. It just was a little awkward there for a while. She's doing fine now. There's a stomach bug been going around, and it just hit her really hard. She got a little bit dehydrated, so they checked everything out and sent her on home, and she's fine now. But I appreciate everybody's concern and questions about that. All right, this is our next to last lesson on Samuel. We'll end up next week by talking about the anointing of David, and also spend some time going back a few chapters looking at Samuel's farewell address. But today we want to talk about rejecting Saul. Last week, as you remember, Samuel was sort of the minor character. Saul's the primary character here as he's becoming anointed as Israel's king. So now we're going to find out why he loses the kingship. There are two episodes, so let's just dive in. 1 Samuel chapter 13. Let's set the scene just a little bit. There has been a low-level conflict between the Philistines and the Israelites the whole time. And by the way, the picture on the screen is an artist's depiction of Samuel leaving Saul for the final time. Because as he did so, you remember Saul reached out and grabbed his robe and tore a piece of it off, and Samuel turned that into a metaphor, which we'll get to here later. But that's an artist's depiction of what that scene might have looked like. All right. So you have this low-level conflict going on, and Jonathan took a squad of soldiers and defeated a Philistine garrison at Geba. Well, if you are the Philistines, you're not going to let something like that stand. So they assembled their army and marched upon Israel to teach the Israelites a lesson. In response, Saul called out the army of Israel, basically every adult male, and they all assembled at Gilgal. We talked about that last week, that location just north of Jericho where Joshua had made his camp. So it was a special place to Israel. And the Israelites assembled at Gilgal and started to realize that they were both outnumbered and outgunned by the Philistines. Now, outnumbered you can understand, but here's what I mean by outgunned. The Philistines had iron weapons. The Israelites did not. What weapons they had, some of their weapons literally would have been scythes and hoes and farm tools, which might have had iron tips, but maybe not. If they had a weapon proper, it would have been made out of bronze. And I'm no metallurgist, but I do know that iron is harder than bronze. And if you take an iron sword and cross a bronze sword with it, the iron sword's going to win. So the Israelites are outnumbered and outgunned, and as they began to realize that, they began to get afraid and go home. Some of them going so far as to flee across the Jordan River to get away from the Philistines. So that's the situation as we get into about verse 8. Samuel has called the people together. They're getting scared. They're leaving, and it's been 7 days. The time that Samuel had told him, "You wait for me 7 days, and then we'll start the battle." Well, Saul's getting nervous. He's losing everybody, and they haven't even offered the sacrifice yet. Now, you may wonder why that's so important. Everybody thought that their God fought the other side's God when two nations went to battle. You had a battle here on earth that you could see, and then you had a battle up in the heavens that you couldn't see. And if my side won, that meant that my God conquered your God. And very often, if there were idols, anything that depicted the defeated God, the conquering army would take those things and put them in the temple of their God so that their God would have the signs of his victory. You remember what happened with the Ark of the Covenant when the Israelites took it into battle and lost to the Philistines? The Philistines, so their god Dagon won the battle, right? So they took the ark and they placed it in Dagon's temple so that he would have a reminder or would have the fruits of his victory there present in his temple. So if your God is going to, if you expect your God to fight for you, then before you go into battle, you need to offer sacrifice and make sure he's on your side. Maybe you need to repent of something you've done to offend him to make sure he's on your side. It wasn't just the Israelites that offered sacrifice before battle. Pretty much everybody did. In fact, some of them, they would offer sacrifice and they would cast lots and perform other omens to try to determine just the right time when their God was primed for battle, just the right time to initiate the war. You see something similar to this in Esther chapter 3 and verse 7. If you remember the story of Esther, there's a fellow named Haman who's gotten himself all twisted up in knots because Mordecai the Jew, Esther's uncle, would not pay him proper respect, meaning bow down and put his face on the ground before him when Haman walks by. Jews didn't bow down to other men. They bowed down only to the Lord God. So Haman comes up with this plan that he's going to get the emperor to decree that on a specific day all the Jews are going to be slaughtered all throughout the Persian Empire. But he can't just walk in anytime he feels like it and make that request of the emperor. What if it's not the right time? What if the gods are not behind this? Look at what they did. In the first month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast pur, that is lots, before Haman day after day, and they cast it month after month until the 12th month. You get that? They cast lots for a year, waiting for the right omen, the right sign that this is the right time to go make this request of the king, of the emperor. And so when all the signs were finally in favor, he goes in and makes the request, and the king says, "Do whatever you want." Not realizing, of course, that he condemned his own queen to death, but that's a whole nother book. The point is, you didn't take major steps and make major decisions unless you knew the gods were in favor. So you would offer sacrifice before war. Now, Saul has been waiting 7 days. Samuel hasn't shown up. The people are scattering. That they were outnumbered to start with. Everybody that leaves, Saul looks and thinks, it's just less and less chance that Saul is going to win. So he finally decides, I'm going to go ahead and offer the sacrifice. Got to do something to keep the people together. Got to do something to make the people think that God's on their side. Now, what's the problem with Saul offering the sacrifice? He's not a priest. It's, according to the law of Moses, it's not lawful for him to offer the sacrifice. So he does it. I kind of imagine 6.5 days have gone by. This is the 7th day. We're well into the 7th day. He offers the sacrifice, and just as it's consumed on the altar, who shows up? Samuel. Now, this has clearly been a test. Samuel is going to get Saul to wait for almost the full 7 days to just see if Saul would do it, and Saul would not. And then he starts giving his reasons for what he was doing. Look at verse 12. The Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal, and I have not sought the favor of the Lord. So I forced myself and offered the burnt offering. I didn't really want to do it, but I can't go into battle without seeking the Lord's favor. Now, what's wrong with that excuse? Did he really need sacrifice to seek the Lord's favor? He could have fallen to his knees and commanded all of Israel to fall on their knees with him and as one army pray to God for help, couldn't they? He didn't need to offer the sacrifice. Now, the real reason he did it, if you look back up in verse 11 and 12, Samuel asked him, "What have you done?" And Saul admits, "When I saw that the people were scattering, and that you didn't come within the days appointed, the Philistines and mustered at Michmash, and I said the Philistines will come down against me, and I'm not saw." See, the real problem is the people were scattering. And the only thing Saul could see was everybody leaves, I have that much less power. And I'm not going to take on the Philistines with half an army. Now, here's what Saul neglected to remember. Samson almost single-handedly destroyed the Philistines because God gave him the power to do so. Gideon defeated the combined Midianite Amalekite army. That army is described as having camels without number. And I don't think you could guarantee that every man in that army had a camel. So if you couldn't begin to count the camels, how many people were there? And how many people did Gideon take into that battle? 300 men conquered an army beyond counting. In 1 Samuel chapter 7 that I mentioned earlier this morning, the Israelites assembled not for war, but to renew their covenant. And the Philistines chose that moment to attack. They were going to attack an outnumbered and unprepared Israel. But God caused the thunder, sent the Philistines into a panic, and unprepared Israel achieved a great victory. That's what led to setting up the Ebenezer, the stone of remembrance. Now, and then Saul himself had defeated Nahash and the Ammonites. We talked about that last week. When the Spirit of God seized him and he did what God told him to do, Saul himself achieved a great victory. My point is, if Saul had just stopped for a moment and asked himself, what is God capable of? He would have realized it didn't matter that his army was frittering away, because it didn't rely on his army's power in the first place. If Israel achieved a victory, it would be because God made it happen. And whether it was 30 men, 300 men, or 3,000 men, or 30,000, it doesn't matter. The power in the victory belongs to God. But all Saul could see was himself and his own abilities. And so he took care of it by himself, and as a result, lost the kingdom. The consequences of his failure, and I'm sorry, I've got a little bit out of order on your outline. Look at the consequences of his failure. In verse 15, Samuel leaves him, a visible sign of God's absence. But before he left, he told him, you're going to lose the kingdom. Your heirs will not follow you to the throne, because the Lord has sought out a man after his own heart. Now, we know who that's talking about. That's David, and we'll get to him next week. But that man after God's own heart kind of, I think, has two meanings here. First, it says something about David's character. David is a man who seeks God's heart. For all of his flaws, David, when you really put him to the test, David tried to do what God wanted. Even when he sinned, when it was pointed out to him, he was quick to repent and call on God to forgive him. So, commenting about David's character, but it's also saying, I think, that it's going to be a man of God's choosing. You remember the reason why Saul was chosen? Tall, good-looking. He looked like a king, so it would be easier for Israel to accept him as a king. Well, this time around, we're going to have a man chosen to God's specifications, not Israel's specifications. A man of God's choosing, not Israel's choosing. Now, for what it's worth, I'm afraid that sometimes we're too quick to act. We have something going on, some sort of problem in our lives, and what we really should do is stop and pray. What we actually do is get busy trying to fix it ourselves. And sometimes we don't ever remember to stop and ask God. But think about it. Doesn't the same principle apply? When you face a great challenge, how are you going to get through it? The power of God. I don't care what you wind up doing. Your victory will belong to God. That's the truth of the matter, folks. Now, if that's true, and I believe it is, then the first step to respond to any challenge should not be, what resources do I have? The first response should be, God, I need your help. But I'm afraid that too often we act like Saul. All right, the final rejection of Saul. So he's already lost the kingdom in the future. Now there's going to be another step to the rejection. God tells him, you're to go, this is chapter 15, you're to go fight the Amalekites. The Amalekites were long time enemies of Israel. They attacked them on the way out of Egypt during the Exodus. After Moses sent the spies, and the spies came in with a bad report, and Moses said, because of this bad report, you're going to wander the desert for 40 years. We remember the Israelites decided that they would try to attack up into Canaan anyway, even though God was no longer with them. They were going to do it anyway. Guess who attacked them as they were on their approach? The Amalekites. In Judges chapter 3, the Moabites suppressed Israel. That's when Ehud assassinated the Moabite king Eglon. Well, guess who the Moabites' allies were? Our friends, the Amalekites. In Judges chapter 6, when Gideon had to defeat the Midianites with 300 men, guess who was part of the Midianite army? The Amalekites. We're told in Judges chapter 12 that after the conquest, they still maintained a hold on territory within the territory of Ephraim. It seems like every time you turn around in the book of Joshua and Judges and so on, every time you turn around, the Amalekites are showing up, giving the Israelites trouble. They're responsible for the death of a lot of Israelites. So it's no surprise that the Amalekites were longtime targets of God's wrath. In Deuteronomy chapter 25, this is before Moses dies, before the conquest starts. Okay, so some of these attacks haven't even occurred yet. But even then, God told the Israelites through Moses that once you enter the promised land, you are to destroy the Amalekites. That's Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 17 through 19. And notice what, in fact, you turn over there for just a moment. Yeah, turn over for just a moment. Deuteronomy chapter 25. I want you to notice what they're accused of specifically. Remember what Amalek did to you on the way as you came out of Egypt, how he attacked you on the way when you were faint and weary, and cut off your tail those who were lagging behind you, and he did not fear God. Therefore, when the Lord your God has given you rest from all your enemies, you will blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven, and you shall not forget. You see what they're charged with? Cutting off those those who were lagging behind. Now, who would it be that's lagging behind at the back of the Israelite as they move through the desert? The old, the weak, the sick, children. That's the kind of people the Amalekites were. They wouldn't gather and face the Israelites, army to army. They just stayed around the edges and constantly were picking off people who couldn't fend for themselves. So Moses tells them that time's coming. God will expect you to destroy them. So, back to 1 Samuel chapter 15. Samuel says to Saul, "The Lord sent me to anoint you king over his people. Now therefore listen to the words of the Lord. I have noted what Amalek did to Israel in opposing them on the way that they came up out of Egypt. Now go and strike Amalek and devote to destruction all that they have. Do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey." The word there is haram, to ban something, to devote it. It can mean to devote something positively, like you're going to give something to God, you devote it to God. But it also means devoted to destruction or extermination. So haram. And then something that has been devoted, a devoted thing or a thing set for extermination, is karam. It means completely given over with no chance of redemption. Leviticus chapter 27, if something has been devoted to God, not necessarily for destruction, but if it's been devoted to God, same word, it cannot be redeemed. Some things could be redeemed, like God had a claim on the firstborn of every, not just humans, but of all the animals as well. Some animals, the firstborn, could be redeemed by a payment. Well, if something has been haram devoted, you can't redeem it. In Joshua chapter 6, the Israelites were told that the city of Jericho and everything in it was haram, devoted to destruction. And they were not allowed to keep anything from the city. And you remember what happened? Achan saw a little bit of money and some nice cloth, and he kept it and snuck it into his tent. Nobody's going to know about it. And a week later, the Israelites are thoroughly defeated by the little bitty town of Ai. And a bunch of Israelites died because Achan violated the commandment of Haram. And do you remember what the penalty was? He took what was devoted to destruction, so he became devoted to destruction, and he and his whole family were put to death. In Exodus chapter 22, verse 20, if a person sacrifices to another god, they become haram. In Deuteronomy chapter 13, if a whole city or town sets up an altar to another god and begins to worship that god, that whole town or city becomes haram, devoted to destruction. It's far more common in the Old Testament than you might think. And it's also a concept that was shared with the nations around them. Some of you may remember Mesha, the king of Moab in King of Moab in 2 Kings chapter 3. And 2 Kings chapter 3, we're told that he was paying tribute to the Israelite king. But archaeologists have found what's called the Mesha stele. It's a tablet, a monument to himself that he left reciting some of the deeds that he performed with the power of his god, Chemosh. And he mentions that he utterly slaughtered the inhabitants of a place called Nebo because he had devoted it to his god, Chemosh. And guess what word he used there? Haram. Moabite and Hebrew are so close. One scholar said they're closer than French and Spanish. You know, they're like dialects of the same language almost. So it's a concept that went beyond Israel. Now, we need to talk for just a moment about the morality of devoting something to destruction. And the first thing I want to say about that is be very careful. Be very careful. We're coming real close to judging God's commandments, and that's a dangerous thing to do. Even more so, we're judging God's commandments by our standards. Now that's become a real popular thing here in our culture, in our current culture. There are all kinds of people, historical figures, who are being judged by modern standards and found to be failures. You know, statues of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, almost all the founding fathers have been removed because they don't measure up to our current standards of morality. It always makes me wonder, what are people 200 years from now going to think of us? And what standards are they going to use to judge us? And if we could be there then, would we think it was fair? So we got to be careful about the mindset here. You know, I think it's okay to ask, what is God doing? But be very careful about judging his commandments. That's a dangerous thing to do. That's actually presumptuous and arrogant. Also, you need to remember, God never tells us everything. Behind every episode in the Bible, behind every commandment in the Bible, there is so much more that we're not told. Remember what God said? I'm sorry, I've lost the reference, but God, my ways are higher than your ways. There's always things that God is thinking about and taking into account that we don't know about. So we want to judge by our standards when we don't even have all the information. So with that in mind, let's look at this decision. You need to realize that this is not a rash or precipitous decision, but it comes after many, many long years of God's patience. In Genesis chapter 15, God tells Abraham that his children are going to wind up slaves in Egypt for 400 years. Do you remember why? Verse 6, because the sin of the Amorites is not yet complete. Now, Amorite was kind of a generic term for anybody living in Canaan. Guess who was already living there at that time? The Amalekites. They were already resident in Canaan. So the Israelites are going to be slaves in Egypt for 400 years so that the sin of the Amorites can become complete. In other words, so that it's like God is saying they're already determined to be sinful people, but they're not yet sinful enough to be destroyed. We're going to give them time to see just exactly what they become. And what they became was 400 years more evil. Okay? So, again, God's not doing this rashly. I have to believe that there were multiple attempts by God to steer the Amalekites and all the other residents of Canaan back to righteousness. In Amos chapter 9, verse 7, Amos 9, verse 7, I want you to look over there. This is a verse that shocks a lot of people when they first become aware of it. It shocked the Israelites when they heard it. Amos is speaking to the kingdom of Israel, the northern of the two kingdoms, and he says, "Are you not like the Cushites to me, O people of Israel, declares the Lord? Did I not bring Israel up from the land of Egypt?" Now catch this. "And the Philistines from Caphtor, and the Syrians from Kir." You see what Amos is quoting God that's saying there? I didn't just bring you to your homeland. I brought the Philistines to their homeland. And I brought the Syrians to their homeland. Guess who two of Israel's biggest enemies were? The Philistines and the Syrians. And God is saying, I worked in the lives of those nations. Are we ever told about that? Other than right here, no. But folks, I am firmly convinced that all through the Old Testament, God is working in the lives of every nation, trying to draw people to Him. And sometimes you see success from those efforts. In Genesis chapter 14, we meet a curious figure named Melchizedek. Remember what he's called? Priest of God Most High. And Abraham, God's chosen, right, actually tithes to Melchizedek. In other words, Abraham, God's man, recognizes Melchizedek as his spiritual superior. And Melchizedek is, by our way of looking at things, a pagan, except he'd come to the knowledge of God. Then go to Exodus chapter 18, and you have Jethro, who's Moses' father-in-law. Jethro was from the people of Midian, a particular clan called the Kenites. Jethro was also a priest of God. He was a priest of God. He offered a sacrifice, and Moses and all the elders of Israel participated in it. So who must he have been sacrificing to? The Lord God, Israel's God. And Moses and the leaders of Israel recognized that. See, it's possible for the quote-unquote pagans to find God. It happened. So the pagan nations, the bottom line is, any nation that became Karam, they had earned it. They had earned it. God had given them 400 years, and it worked in their lives, and they refused Him over and over and over again. To the point that some of the nations Israel destroyed actually practiced human sacrifice, which I would regard as the ultimate evil. Taking a baby and killing it as an offering to your God. So there was evil. There was evil among the people that were Haram. Now also you need to remember that in the Old Testament, God doesn't just deal with individuals, He deals with nations. In the book of Judges, when Israel was oppressed, God raised up a judge and rescued them, freed them, right? Do you really think that every one of the Israelites had repented and returned to faith in God when He rescued them? I don't think it's 100%. Now, as a whole, the nation did, and that's why God rescued them. Every single one of them? No, but He's dealing with a nation. In 1 Chronicles chapter 21, David commits Saul's offense here from 1 Samuel 15, and he numbers the people of Israel. He's trying to see how big his army is because he's starting to trust in that rather than God. And he gets called on it because it's a sin. And he's given a choice. You can have 3 years of famine, 3 months of losing to all of your enemies, or 3 days of pestilence. And he says, I would rather suffer at the hand of God than of man. So he chooses the 3 days of pestilence. 70,000 Israelites died. Whose sin was it? but he deals with the nation as a whole, doesn't he? God dealt with nations. So when you devote a nation to destruction, that's not making a judgment on each and every individual in that nation. It's a judgment on the nation of a whole. Now, and also don't forget, we don't want to confuse consequences with guilt. Let's say that I am a drunk daily, or I'm an addict. Are my wife and children going to suffer? Almost surely they will. What did they do? They had the bad luck to be born in my family. But they didn't do anything. They're not guilty of anything. But they suffer the consequences of the sin, don't they? Now, in 1 Samuel 15, it talks about, look at verse 3, it talks about destroying even the children and infants. That's not making a judgment that they're guilty. They suffer the consequences for the guilt of the nation they happen to be born into, because God was dealing with nations. Now, just for what it's worth, in Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 31 through 33, Jeremiah talks about God having a new covenant that he would write on their hearts. That seems to imply to me that there was a day coming when God would deal more with individuals than with nations. And isn't that more the system that we live under now as Christians? I choose to become a Christian. I'm no longer a drunk or an addict. My family would be blessed by that, even if they didn't become Christians. But they would have to individually make that choice, didn't they? If I become a Christian, that doesn't automatically mean my wife and kids are. They have to make that choice. So God has kind of, I think, shifted from dealing with nations to strictly dealing with individuals. So they are told to utterly destroy the Amalekites. And as you know, if you've read the chapter, Saul didn't do it. Look at verse 9. Saul and the people spared Agag, that's the king of the Amalekites, and the best of the sheep and the oxen and the fatted calves and the lamb and all that was good, and would not utterly destroy them. Now, why do you want to keep that stuff? It's valuable. Take it home and look what it's going to do to my flocks and herds. Now look at the rest of that verse. All that was despised and worthless, they devoted to destruction. So they destroyed the stuff that nobody wanted anyway. Now, I once worked with a guy that he had a pretty strong view about people bringing clothing for our giveaway room. The church in Virginia, and we had a pretty good sized room where people would bring used clothing, and the community was allowed to come in and take what they needed. And he said, if you're bringing stuff that you no longer wear, you're not giving anything. You're just cleaning out your closet. Because it has no value to you. You weren't going to wear it anyway. And, this was in the mid-'80s. And sometimes people were bringing in their clothes from the 70s. Stuff that people in their right mind would not wear at that point. And they really were just cleaning out their closets. He says, if you want to give something, then you go to the department store and you buy some new shirts and some new pants and some new socks and some new shoes, and you come and you put those in the clothing room. Then you're giving something because it cost you something. Well, the Israelites devoted to destruction only the stuff that nobody wanted anyway. They weren't giving up anything, were they? They kept all the good stuff. And Saul, their leader, allowed it to happen. Then in verse 13, Samuel shows up and Saul greets him. This is to me, this is kind of hilarious. Samuel shows up and Saul says, "Blessed to you be the Lord. I have performed the commandment of the Lord." He's so proud of himself. And Samuel's answer is, well, then why do I hear farm animals? Everything was to be devoted to destruction, right? There should have been silence in that city. And so Saul starts to explain, they, In other words, the people, see, he's not involved. He's not responsible. They have brought them from the Amalekites, for the people spared the best of the sheep and the oxen and to sacrifice them to the Lord. Sure. I'm sure they were planning to sacrifice all those valuable animals. The rest we devoted to destruction. Now, go on down to verse 20. Even after Samuel has begun to rebuke him, Saul says to Samuel, I have obeyed the voice of the Lord. I've gone on the mission which the Lord sent me. He's still insisting, I did what God commanded me to do. And so Samuel finally tells him in verse 22, does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as obeying the voice of the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice. For rebellion is as the sin of divination, and presumption is as iniquity and idolatry. Disobedience is rebellion because you're presuming to know better than God. And it's equivalent to idolatry because you're placing something else in God's place. You're placing your judgment in God's place. There is a Greek philosopher known as Mediocrities. That seems to be what motivated Saul. That's good enough. We keep a few for ourselves. Why would the Lord care? We got close enough. Good enough doesn't count with God's commands. That's, I understand that there are a lot of things in the Bible that you could call gray areas, that we have difficulty understanding. That can mean this, they can mean that, they can mean a lot of things. But there are some things that are pretty black and white, and this is one of them. If God says, go and do X, Y, and Z, anything other than X, Y, and Z, it doesn't count. It's not good enough. There is no good enough with God. It's either you did or you didn't. Some of you are familiar with the story of Uzzah from 2 Samuel chapter 6. The Ark of the Covenant had been captured, and long story, but it wound up staying in a couple of people's homes for 20, 30 years. And finally, David is going to bring the Ark to Israel to centralize the worship of God, to Jerusalem, to centralize the worship of God there in the capital city. Not a bad thing to do. The problem is the law of Moses says the Ark is to be carried on wooden poles covered with gold that are strung through the eyelets on this, or whatever you want to call them, rings on the side of the ark, and placed on the priest's shoulders. And 6 or 8 priests would be holding these poles and carrying the ark. Well, they didn't do that. They put it on a cart pulled by a couple of oxen, and a fellow named Uzzah was driving the cart. And they're on their way, and the oxen stumble, and the ark starts to tip like it's going to fall out. Uzzah did exactly what you and I and anybody who believed in God would do. He reached out and grabbed the ark to keep it from falling. And what happened to him? He was struck dead there on the spot because God said, don't ever touch the ark. Not even the priest could touch the ark. That's why they carried it on poles strung through those rings so that nobody would touch the ark. Now, if they'd done what God commanded, nobody would have died. But they didn't do. They did, it's good enough. Look, the ox cart will work. And Uzzah died. Now, by the way, I don't believe that God condemned Uzzah for that. Okay? Remember, consequences and guilt are not always the same thing. But when God says something, he pretty well means it. There is no, well, that's good enough with God. Mediocrities notwithstanding. All right. Yes. 1 minute. Okay, I've been informed that it would be good if we stayed in here until the second bell, because when we go out, the other class pretty much has to end, even though they were counting on the full time. People that I'm in other churches I've been at would be surprised that I'm constantly finishing before the end. That's not my reputation, but seems to be happening here. Anyway, next week we'll look at the anointing of David, chapter 16. And then we're going to go also tie in chapter 12, Samuel's farewell address. And that will conclude our study on Samuel. How much time do I have left now, Barrett? Another 30 seconds? Yeah. But anyway, but I appreciate your attention this morning.